Hi, I'm beloved political commentator Matt Lewis, welcoming you back to an exciting episode of Matt Lewis and the News. We have a great guest today, but before we get started, I wanted to thank Ron Holyfield for underwriting today's podcast. Ron is a servant leadership provocateur who speaks at over 50 events per year. He is the author of Fourth Dimension Leadership, a radical strategy for creating an authentic servant leadership culture. You can connect with him about speaking at your conference or business meeting at info@ronholyfield.com. Our guest today is Michael Weir. Michael served in the White House faith-based initiatives during President Obama's first term and directed faith outreach for President Obama's historic 2012 re-election campaign. Michael is the author of the book Reclaiming Hope, and through his Substack newsletter, Michael provides exclusive analysis of the 2020 presidential race, a recap of the essential news in faith and politics, highlights of must-read content, and even some inspiration along the way. You can also check out his new podcast with the AND campaign called Faith 2020. Michael Weir, welcome back to the news.
Great to be with you.
Let's start with 2020 and the Democratic race. Now, we're taping this before the debates, so this will probably come out after some of the debates. But so far, through the prism of your expertise, which is faith, how are they doing? Where are we?
Yeah, well, it already seems to be an improvement over 2016. So you have multiple Democrats who are able to speak about faith in a compelling way, in a personal way. They're able to respond to questions. Candidates like Pete Buttigieg, Cory Booker, Joe Biden, even Elizabeth Warren. And so that's promising. Just today it was made public that the DNC has brought on someone to do faith outreach, which is an improvement over the last cycle. We'll see how the campaigns do and whether they hire up, which they need to. I'll be concerned if we get to the end of the summer and there isn't a faith infrastructure on these campaigns. But, the opportunity is significant. Not only do faith voters make up the vast majority of the Democratic electorate, but there are faith voters who are independents, even Republicans, who have serious moral concerns about this president. But it will require a Democratic candidate who's willing to actually ask for their votes, not just assume that they're going to be repelled to vote for a Democrat in order for the nominee to be successful.
You said that, I think you implied at least, that most Democratic voters are faith voters. Are they just people of faith, or are they people who that you know prioritize faith in their voting?
Well, so the most committed Democrats, African Americans, are also the most religiously engaged population in the country. They attend church the most. They pray the most. They engage Scripture the most. The Democratic Party is more, in terms of percentages, the Democratic Party does have more religious nuns or atheists than Republicans.
When you say nuns.
Not nuns. I'm not talking about Catholic nuns. It was funny, for a while we were talking about the rise of the nuns, and I always imagined like just a bunch of sisters,
It's the most confusing thing to talk about, but you mean no religious affiliation.
Yeah, those with no religious affiliation. So we have a diverse party in that way, and there are tensions that come from having a party that's basically 2/3 religious and 1/3 religiously unaffiliated.
The third that's, so, there was this big New York Times story, and it shows that the rank and file Democratic voter is pretty moderate, pretty pragmatic. I'm guessing some of the same people you're talking about.
That's right.
But there is a very loud minority of what could be called woke Twitter, of people who tend to be probably white, very progressive, very secular, and hostile to, in many ways, I would say hostile to people of faith.
I do think that there's that strain. I think that it requires pushback from party leadership. I think we need a nominee who's willing to push back on that sort of aggressive secularism that's deeply at odds with the way that many Democrats live their lives and view the role of their faith in public life. So that's a tension within the party. Barack Obama was kind of the perfect person to help cover up some of those tensions. It'll be interesting to see if we get another leader as our nominee in 2020 who's able to do the same, or if we see that.
It seems like Buttigieg would potentially be, if that's the main goal,
Sure.
that he might be the best equipped, both because of his personal biography and positioning and because of his rhetorical ability. I mean, he seems like he is very similar to Obama in some ways rhetorically.
Yeah, I think Buttigieg, I think Biden would be effective through that lens. Even to a certain extent, someone like Cory Booker, given his sort of deep roots engaging broad swaths of the faith community, engaging even conservative evangelicals on criminal justice reform, and so there are candidates that have that talent. One of the issues is that the Trump era has made some of those strident voices that you were talking about even more explicit about and antagonistic towards particularly conservative religious believers. And so now some Democrats view it as a risk to even extend an olive branch because A, they don't think it will be reciprocated, and B, they think they could depress turnout among some of their core supporters and as you sort of alluded, donors.
Yeah. Well, and that seems like a real, in my opinion, now look, who am I to give advice to liberal Democrats? But I wrote a book trying to give advice to conservative Republicans that they promptly ignored, and I suspect Democrats will ignore my advice as well. But it seems to me like that this is a total missed opportunity, which is to say that there are, as you've noted, there are a lot of people of faith who are not happy with some of the things President Trump has done and or said. Let's look at the family separation at the border, which is something that a lot of people of faith who talk about being a compassionate conservative, like this is uncompassionate conservatism, who might have a concern with, and yet the left, the radical left, if you are a devout Christian who's got a conservative to a moderate temperament, but yet you see some of the things that are said by AOC or Ilhan Omar or any other Democrat, it's hard to say, well, I'm going to go vote for their nominee.
Well, look, it's a lot of Democrats are running in opposition to Trump's, dividing the country and, otherizing communities. It's really hard to run on that message if you're going to say, for instance, like Senator Gillibrand recently said in an interview with the Des Moines Register editorial board, that if you're pro-life, which by the way, half the country is, that you're akin to an anti-Semite or a racist, and that the political discussion on that issue is over. Then you have these kinds of voters that we're talking about who no longer have moral clarity that they can either vote for someone who supports child separation, who speaks unkindly and in a poor and derogatory fashion about broad swaths of the country, and a Democrat who's trying to bring the country together. They have to vote between two candidates that hold views that they view to be morally repugnant. As a Democrat who wants to see Trump out of office, I think that we should give voters an easier choice than that.
Yeah, but Charlie Camosi has a book out now called about a consistent life ethic.
That's right.
It's called Resisting Throwaway Culture. And it is interesting to me that there isn't a political party or movement that actually has a consistent ethic on this. And it could have been that Democrats would have seized the opportunity to try to become that party. But I guess that the nature of politics, where you have to gin up the base and donors and activists, just doesn't allow occupying that territory that's been abandoned, I would argue, by Trump.
Not right now. There's the graph that's become infamous over the last few months that shows sort of that the quadrant of fiscal liberals and social conservatives is like the most untapped political demographic in the country. And I think that's true. Now, one of the reasons for that is that quadrant is full of people, but those people don't have the levers of power. They don't have the finances. They don't have the infrastructure that those in the quadrants that dominate American politics right now do. But there are signs of John Bell Edwards in Louisiana.
Yeah.
I think that
It's
there
the
are
governor of Louisiana who's
governor of
pro-life.
Louisiana, yeah, who expanded Medicaid, who's pro-life, who's really advancing the whole life message and speaks about it in that way. And then I also think there's a lesson in where Democrats have lost. I mean, is the Democratic Party stronger without Joe Donnelly in the Senate or Heidi Heitkamp? Is the Democratic Party stronger with Pat Toomey in the Senate as opposed to another candidate who ran like Bob Casey, who wins election after election? And so I think,
but I think wouldn't Democrats argue that these candidates lost election? And so I mean, maybe this is an indictment on the pro.
Sure.
You could argue that this is an indictment on the pro-life movement for not supporting conservative Democrats. But it's hard to go to Democrats and criticize them when they could say, like, look, Heidi Heitkamp lost.
Yeah, but right. So Heidi Heitkamp has had to spend capital distancing herself from a party that put Hyde on the platform. Claire McCaskill had to fight her own state party just weeks before her election because they unilaterally stripped out pro-life language that Missouri Democrats voted on to go into the platform. And so a part of this is having a party with a national brand that allows for diverse candidates to proudly affiliate as Democrats and for voters to view the Democratic Party as a party that has room for them. And unfortunately, that hasn't always been the case.
Since you mentioned Hyde, I have to ask you, of course, about Joe Biden, who had supported the Hyde Amendment, which it had to be renewed, I think, every year or two, but it would essentially, in most cases, stop taxpayer funding of abortion. And Biden had supported that for decades, and now, presumably under political duress, maybe from his staff, certainly from his base and from his rivals, had to flip-flop on that. What do you make of that?
Well, I think there's a lot going on here. I think the first thing to say is that, the other candidates, in my view, had the wrong view, before Joe Biden. And so, it's not like there's another candidate running that has a better position on Hyde. So that's important. I do think Biden is responding, especially in these early stages of the primary, to a base that is acting in reaction to the Republican Party. And anything President Trump supports, they think that we need to oppose. I was disappointed in the vice president's flip. I do think he's going to be making the case his flip was tied to his health care plan, which is expands the federal role in health care. And so if you have many more millions of people who are accessing health care through the federal government, Hyde takes on sort of a new implications for those voters. But look, the polling is really clear on this. Strong majorities of the American people oppose federal funding for abortion. For all of the rhetoric among Democrats that all you have to do to have the quote-unquote right position on Hyde is listen to women, 41% of Democratic women compared to 39% 41% of Democratic women support Hyde compared to 39% who do not. So if they were listening to women, even their own party's women, things wouldn't be as clear as sort of they say on the campaign trail and in interviews organized by Planned Parenthood.
So why, this raises the obvious question, then why do it? I mean, if 2/3 of, is it right, 2/3 of the Democratic Party are faith voters and a majority of women in America support Hyde, why would Joe Biden feel pressure to have to change?
Yeah, well, again, it goes, so in part, just to say the religious community in America, there are diverse views on these questions. The second thing I'd say is to point back to what I said before, which is Donald Trump is giving State of the Union addresses, accusing Democrats of wanting to execute babies. He's appointing Supreme Court justices and saying that they're going to support undoing Roe v. Wade. And so it kind of it's a reaction to the polarization that we're seeing, and this idea that only Republicans are susceptible to the pull of polarization. It's Democrats who are completely rational and sort of just doing their own thing is just not true. We're seeing Democrats able to be lulled into
Look, I think Obama,
reaction just like Republicans.
I think President Obama made Republicans less pro-immigration in some ways. I mean, some of it may have been trolling, some of it may have been intentional with the DREAM Act, and some of it may just have been if he's for it, we're against it, right? And negative polarization.
On the flip side of that, Barack Obama also had the ability to, by taking a more reasonable position on issues like abortion, was able to provoke a response from Republicans that drew them to the middle. So if you watch, for instance, those debates with John McCain, where an abortion question was posed, Barack Obama calls for reducing the number of abortions in this country, strengthening adoption, and John McCain has no option other than to basically say, yeah, I agree with you, I support those things too. Unfortunately, we have a Democratic Party right now where our leadership is unwilling to even say those common ground things because some of the left-wing groups just don't want to see compromise on this issue.
Buttigieg, I would say Biden has a little bit. Buttigieg does that to a certain degree, but then he attacked Mike Pence.
Yeah.
What did you make of that? And that bothered me. Up until then, I was starting. I mean, I don't know if I was going to go vote for Pete Buttigieg. We probably disagree ideologically, but I was sort of seeing him as someone that I could connect with a little bit and maybe have an affinity to. I had a certain affinity toward President Obama.
Yeah.
And then when he goes after Mike Pence like that, I don't know.
It's I understand there's personal history and personal animosity there. Of course, for folks who watched when Mike Pence was governor, the personal history seemed to be that they actually worked together and got along
right.
pretty well. It's another case of Democrats don't like Mike Pence, and so Pete Buttigieg is kind of leveraging that. And also, I think he has significant disagreements with Mike Pence. I didn't like the sort of look. Republicans for decades used religion as a weapon to sort of say that Democrats were out of the mainstream, to sort of otherize Democrats as un-American. It's a big mistake for Democrats to do the same. Pete Buttigieg is also, he's kind of used different language each time he said it, but he's kind of said that Christianity leads to having progressive values. Well, that's close to a mirror image of the moral majority saying that if you're a Christian, you're going to be a Republican. And I have friends on both the left and the right who are done with that, who want people to bring their faith into the public square, but don't stamp the approval of your faith on a political party platform. Political party platforms are far too imperfect and fluid for that kind of eternal weight.
You mentioned earlier how at least Democrats this time around have the ability to talk about faith a little more eloquently and have some sort of plan for outreach. Let's talk about Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, sure.
She's apparently a devout Methodist, grew up in a Methodist household.
Absolutely.
But there's an argument, I've heard some people say, that she didn't have a very robust faith outreach and that maybe she could have won the election if she had done so.
Yeah, I'm one of those people, and I'm also one of those people who think that the problem wasn't Hillary Clinton herself. Actually, Hillary Clinton has a long history of engaging religious communities, even conservative religious communities, extremely effectively. International aid trips with religious organizations. You might remember the 90s where she was supporting things like V-Chip to help parents monitor the TV and media that their kids were consuming. When I would meet with National Prayer Breakfast folks when I was working for President Obama, they would speak so fondly of how Hillary and Bill would meet with pastors and with those who attended the prayer breakfast for hours after the breakfast was over. She was a Sunday school teacher. She was motivated by her faith on issues like civil rights. There was a lot of history and story to draw on and tell. The problem was her campaign made the mistake that Democrats over a period of time have wanted to believe was true, which is that religion is no longer a driving force in our politics. And when Democrats have taken that approach, as they did in 2004 with John Kerry, as they did in 2016 with Hillary Clinton, they lose. And it was political malpractice, the way that the Clinton campaign decided that they didn't need to ask for the vote of religious communities explicitly, just like they asked explicitly for the vote of a myriad of other communities in the country.
Do you have any, is there any like documentation? This is anecdotal, or is there like really reason to believe that could have made a difference?
Well, look, so if you look at the drop in support among white evangelicals, even from Obama's 2012 numbers. So remember, in 2008, Barack Obama won about 27% of white evangelicals. In 2012, after he came out in support of same-sex marriage, after attacks that he was waging a war on religion, he won 21% of white evangelicals, 1 out of 5. In 2016, Hillary Clinton won 16% of white evangelicals. Like, you basically have to be trying in order to perform that poorly among white evangelicals. And just remember, they're a quarter of the electorate. And so that's a swing of millions of votes. She lost Catholics. Actually, she didn't gain among any religious group other than, I believe, a 1 to 2 point gain among LDS. I believe she had a 1 or 2 point gain among Jewish community, and then she saw a spike among non-religious communities. But every other, Catholics, mainline Protestants, down the line, she saw a drop from Obama's 2012.
Is this Robbie Mook? Is this? Do we have a sense for who, like?
So Amy Chozick, who I just had on as a guest
on your podcast
on Faith 2020. She wrote a story just right after the election about how Bill Clinton was kind of shut out of campaign conversations. People thought his political, he was a great politician back in the 90s, effective, but his political radar is out of date. And he had been urging them to reach out in the Rust Belt, reach out to blue-collar faith communities. And there was one story Amy Chozick told at the beginning of the story. Hillary Clinton's own supporters, her organizers, were urging the campaign to send Hillary to South Bend, the home of Pete Buttigieg, for the St. Patrick's Day
Notre
parade.
Dame University.
Yes, home of Notre Dame, home of Pete Buttigieg, to the St. Patrick's Day parade. Now, this is a parade that Democratic nominees have attended before. I believe Bill Clinton attended it. It's a popular event. It wasn't an outlandish request.
This is like a white ethnic sort of
Irish. Irish Catholics. Right? Yeah, sure. I think the community itself is diverse, but Catholicism is important, and Irish Catholics are important in South Bend. And so the response that Hillary Clinton's own supporters got from Hillary Clinton's campaign was that white Catholics are not a demographic that we need to be thinking about in this election. Well, white Catholics account for 17% of the electorate. They certainly weren't making a whole bunch of effort to reach out to white evangelicals. So that's getting close to half of the electorate that you're saying saying we don't need to worry about them. Well, you're slicing your margins pretty thin. You don't really have a whole lot of room to operate.
Especially when you consider how many coalitions there are.
Sure.
I don't know, Islanders who are part of the Pride movement. There's a day for them or something. There's like probably a symbol. If you're on a campaign, you could probably go to the store and get swag for like. Sure. Whatever group you have but maybe I don't know if there's like if Hillary had
I don't believe
Catholics
so.
for Hillary.
No, I know we did the Obama campaign. We had Catholics for Obama, believers for Obama, pro-family, pro-Obama, and this was all about making sure that there was a place for everyone in our campaign, that people could see themselves in our campaign. The Clinton campaign didn't hire a faith outreach person until the summer before the election, so just months before the election. They didn't have a page on their website for people of faith. The Clinton campaign did do outreach. She visited primarily African American churches. Early in the campaign, she spoke to a Methodist convention, but overwhelmingly, there was not a big faith moment in that campaign. She didn't give a speech on issues of concern to religious voters in the last year of the campaign. And it's like, people see that. When you have Donald Trump telling conservative Christians, I'm going to protect you. I may not be cut from the same cloth, but I'm the bully you need. Yeah. From Democrats who don't care about you and only want to attack you. And the Democratic response is not to say, no, actually, we have a vision for how you fit in the American family, and we want to support you like we want to support any other American. But they instead see basically silence, a wall of silence from the Democratic nominee. Like they get the message. One candidate is asking for their vote. The other is doing their best to avoid them at any cost. And that hurts. That's how you get 16% of the white evangelical vote and lose Catholics.
And one of the things that happened during the campaign, and I'm reading Ben Howell's book right now, The Immoral Majority, and he talks about sort of the different rationalizations that Christians made for supporting Donald Trump. And there are a bunch of different ones. And some people, I mean, I'm okay with it. I'm like, if you make a rational calculation that Donald Trump is a bad person, he's, not a Christian, but he's the lesser of two evils. I'm not going to drink the Kool-Aid, but I'm going to vote for him. Like, I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
I didn't do that, but my mom did, right?
Yeah, sure.
So people do that. But there are other people who have different rationalizations, and one of them is what I would call the King Cyrus or King David theory, right? And so the theory with King David is, well, he killed a guy, but he was still part of God's plan. And with King Cyrus, it was he's not a believer, he's not one of ours, but God used him to help God's chosen people. And I guess the question I would have is that really, I mean, this to somebody who's not a believer, not only does that sound like a rationalization, it sounds like crazy and absurd.
Yeah.
But I would ask you, as someone who is a believer, isn't it possible that God would use, and that, by the way, Hillary could have been the person too, but isn't it possible that God, that's what I told my relatives when they brought this up. I'm like, well, why couldn't God use Hillary? But isn't it possible that God would use somebody that is not a believer, not a good person, but somebody to achieve his will?
So first, it's really noteworthy that you've noticed that there weren't these kinds of biblical allusions when it came to President Obama. No. That's an interesting, timeless scripture only invoked during Republican administrations. Look, God works as He will. What's interesting about our system of government is that actually God has placed Christians in a place where they have to live out their faith in the voting booth. Like that, you can't sort of shift responsibility from the decision you make as a voter. And so I think it's, I would agree, it sounds like with Ben that it is an absurd rationalization, an obfuscation of responsibility, and a real denial of agency to sort of shift someone's personal support on a King Cyrus model, which is laughable.
Well, I say pray as if it all depends on God, work as if it all depends on you.
That's a good.
That includes voting and activism. And I would ask you, what do you say to people who would challenge the notion that Christians should be involved in this rather dirty, unseemly business that is politics?
Well, I think it's we live in a representative democracy. Each one of us holds the office of citizen, and so you really have to. On what grounds are you going to tell one group of people that they cannot bring their full selves to the public square? And I would make the same argument for Christians who don't believe that there's any room for people of other faiths or no faith at all in public. No, democracy only works if we're able to bring our full selves, including our faith, including our personal experiences, everything that makes up our political views and worldview into the public square and hash it out. If we're trying to artificially sort of tie people's hands behind their back, so to speak, and tell Christians, yeah, you have a political responsibility, but just don't bring, your faith that you say shapes everything that you think and do into political discussions. That's not a real argument. The people who make that argument really just want to prevent a certain kind of thought from being able to be expressed in politics, and we just need to dismiss that out of hand.
I mean, I think right now, you may disagree. I feel like conservative Christians are sometimes told that they should that they shouldn't be injecting faith or values or morals into politics. When we celebrate Dr. King, who the civil rights movement very much built on the black church, and other great, the abolitionist movement and other movements.
Sure, faith has guided some of the most important social movements in this country's history, from civil rights, suffrage, labor, workers' rights. The other thing that's interesting is we've seen this argument when it comes, both from a legal and a political perspective, when it comes to immigration, with Christians, both conservative and liberal Christians, saying, don't bring your faith to this situation. Yes, you're compassionate. Be compassionate on your own time. Don't impose that on the government. And again, we need to dismiss that. Religious people have the same right as everybody else to work and advocate and vote to see their values reflected in politics. Now, I would argue that doesn't mean that that we want to. That's different from a theocracy. That's different from believing that how we would operate our church is the same way we should operate politics. There is a political theology that's different from an ecclesiology, to use some terms. But Christians have every right to translate their faith into politics in an appropriate way.
I have a million questions, but I'm going to try to be disciplined and stick to my time limit here. You mentioned the 2012 re-election, where you were basically heading up the faith for President Obama's re-election campaign. And I've heard you say before that you were ecstatic when you learned that Paul Ryan and not Marco Rubio would be the running mate.
Yeah, I mean, so
this is in 20. Did I say 08? This is 2012.
No, yeah, this is 2012, and so I came onto the campaign in May from the White House, just a couple of weeks after the president announced that he now supported same-sex marriage. We were in the middle of the HHS contraception mandate. There was a certain defensive-ness on the faith front. What really changed much of that in terms of my work was the selection of Paul Ryan as the nominee. And a big reason for that is Paul Ryan was one of the few people that Mitt Romney could have chosen who already had diverse religious groups, from the U.S. Catholic bishops to the National Association of Evangelicals to the National Council of Churches, already on the record calling his signature issue, the budget, immoral and problematic, lacking compassion and unfit for, and not matching the priorities of these religious institutions. And so
this is back when
they couldn't.
This is back when the budget,
when he was chair of Ways and Means, he advanced a budget that Democrats said would cut domestic poverty programs, cut foreign aid.
This is when Republicans cared about deficits and debt.
That's right.
Still.
Yeah. That's right.
And he was saying we have to tackle this debt before it tackles us. He must have said
exactly
it a million times.
Sure. But that approach and what he rolled out, what he said was his signature achievement, something that he staked so much in, it certainly earned him plaudits from some corners in the religious community. And again, conservative, moderate, liberal, there was almost unanimous opposition. And so. Like I wrote in my book, and like I've said on the Faith 2020 podcast, when that decision was made, it really opened the door to tell a positive story about what Barack Obama had accomplished in his first term, the way that he pushed back on those budget cuts in partnership with the Catholic bishops, with the National Association of Evangelicals, and make a positive case to faith voters.
So Ryan's selection as running mate got you back in the game in the faith the faith community.
Broadly, we would have had to be much more focused on it. Here's what it did: it opened the door to persuadable faith voters. My job would have been even more focused on turnout. Had that door.
You think Rubio would have been?
Oh yeah, Rubio would have
tougher.
been much tougher. And I probably shouldn't say this. I think that's very clear in the way that Rubio has been attacked by and criticized by Democratic strategists and Democratic pundits. You only get criticized in that way if people view you as a real political threat, and he was in 2012. I think he would have been. I think he would have been an even greater challenge than Trump in 2016. So yeah, I was relieved that Rubio was not the.
I've noticed the Pod Save America guys are not big fans of Rubio. So
I mean, I didn't want to say it explicitly, but yeah, there is a certain level of. I mean, those guys get politics better than anyone. They see a political talent.
I know you watched the show Veep, which I guess just went off the air with the great Julie Louis-Dreyfus.
Yeah.
I was a little. I don't know if you saw the last couple of episodes.
I did.
Gary takes over faith-based initiatives for Selena Meyer.
Yeah.
And it's not a good look.
So Tony Hale, who plays Gary, I got to be with him while they were taping these episodes, and he told me that this was on its way. So I'd been looking forward to it for a year and a half, and he asked me what it was like working in the White House, and I told him, if I had to summarize the White House in one way, it would have to be moist. That people imagine the West Wing is like this glamorous location when actually it's kind of like a basement, especially where a lot of the staff work. The Oval Office is pretty nice, and he said, I'm going to put that in the show.
That was in the show.
So I was watching the show intently to see if I could get writing credits for Veep. It was very funny, and I think some of the work deserves to be poked fun at a little bit. And
it was a good show, but I mean, for those who haven't seen it, Gary, who is like Selena's handler, body man or whatever you would call it, during this campaign. He gets promoted to leading faith-based initiatives, and basically the only thing that amounts to is the ability to funnel money from the Chinese into the campaign.
Yeah, it was. I can't say that matched my experience, but it was fun to see the faith-based work of the government represented more in Veep than it is in this administration that hasn't staffed its faith-based office at all.
So let's talk a little bit about you since the since 2012.
Yeah.
I mean, you're married. You have a baby. What is? I guess talk about fatherhood, the work-life balance. How fatherhood has changed you. Any of that stuff I'm interested in.
Yeah, So my daughter Saoirse turned 7 months yesterday. I'd wanted to be a father from a relatively for a long time, and she's just an absolute gift. She's a joy to be around, and she's just a lovely girl. She's beautiful. She sleeps like a real champ. I mean, sleeps 10 hours a night. So we try not to tell other parents of babies that, because it can cause some envy. But she's been great. And yeah, my wife, we knew each other in middle school, started dating in high school. We have prom photos next to our wedding photos, and so it's been a whole new thing to be able to raise a child together, to be able to be in a place where she was trying to make sure I wasn't, failing out of high school, and now to be responsible for raising, Saoirse together. It's been, a wonderful trajectory. Yeah.
And I mean, do you find that has changed your worldview or your politics, the policies that you would be interested in?
So, family policies have always been, important to me. So I think it was 2014, I wrote for The Atlantic about, how I viewed a public policy discussion centered on what will help families flourish. I argue that should be at the very center of our political debate. Going through, pregnancy and having a child of my own, it just you understand the intricacies and you understand the difficulties in just a way that that's difficult to grasp without going through it. And we've had an incredible situation. My wife works for an organization that gives really great paid leave. It still was traumatic 6 months after Saoirse was born to drop her off at daycare. That only led me to think about the parents who didn't have the flexibility that we did, that don't have the benefits that we did, who sometimes have to go back to work days, weeks after pregnancy, and that's just not acceptable. It shouldn't be acceptable in America. It shouldn't be acceptable in a country that is profoundly religious still. And we need to work together, Democrats and Republicans, to support basic paid family leave, workplace protections. We need to end pregnancy discrimination. So these are policy positions I've always held, but there's a new thrust and motivation behind them.
Did it reinforce your pro-life stance at all, or was it just,
Yeah.
I know for some people say it makes them more pro-life, some people say less,
Yeah,
I've heard that at least, I don't know.
Yeah, because I know that these situations work out differently for different people.
I don't want to meet the parent who says it made me less pro.
Yeah, right.
Having my kid showed me that.
I think it's just very. I believe there are good enough arguments on the pro-life side that I'm not going to invoke my family in an argument like that.
Yeah,
just out of respect, because what happens when you get into telling, when you use personal stories for public policy, is you're claiming to speak for an experience and what that experience should mean in a way that isn't felt by everyone. This is a principal problem with identity politics, which is sort of the claim that just having a certain experience would lead you to a certain political view, when we know that's not the case.
Or that only someone who's had that experience is enlightened enough to talk about the topic.
And that there's nothing that can be said or explained in a rational way that would be penetrable to someone and that's just destructive to democracy. It's destructive to expanding the public square as opposed to limiting it. So I think that's a broader problem. More specifically, right now I'm a smitten, in the clouds parent of a lovely kid who politics is the last thing on my mind when I'm with her.
Now, I didn't know this until recently that you were adopted.
Yeah.
And I didn't know about that, but you wrote about it recently. How did that impact your worldview?
Gosh, so I wrote an article for Catapult that talked, a bit about this. I think, again, I'm very sort of hesitant to sort of translate personal experiences explicitly in a political way, because I know adoptees. I worked in the White House with adoptees and foster kids, and they're diverse and have different political views. I will say, for me, it's made me grateful for my life. It's made me grateful for nonprofits like Catholic Charities and Bethany, where I serve on the national board, that support families and children. I think we need to, it's helped me see that we need to have a government that's supportive of family formation and supportive of giving families, including adoptive families, the support they need, as opposed to as opposed to not taking responsibility or partial responsibility for the flourishing of families. And it's also made fatherhood, meaningful to me, the ability to raise my daughter. So that's personally powerful.
This would be an amazing place to end, but I got two more questions
Okay.
that I should have worked in earlier.
Yeah.
But I want to ask, Christians are called to pray for their leaders. Should we pray for President Trump?
Every week, yeah.
You do?
Yeah. And it's some weeks it's more difficult than others, but it's doing something good in me. It's helping me to keep in mind that there are things more important than politics, and that ultimately President Trump is not in control as much as he postures himself that way, that God is in control, and that God can be trusted to take care of justice far more than we can. And so I think it's important to pray. If you pray, if you're, I'll speak to the Christian tradition, there's a clear call to pray for our president. Now that doesn't mean that we're political sycophants, whether it's a Democrat or Republican in office. What it does mean is that we want to see leaders who bear a responsibility that is hard to imagine, be blessed and do good and do justice. And I want that for President Trump, just like I wanted it for President Obama and any person in a civic office. And so my church prays. It's a part of the liturgy. Every week we pray for President Trump by name and political leaders, including Speaker Pelosi.
Some people thought that President Obama was actually a Muslim. Other people probably think that it's just an act, that his Christianity, maybe he's not a Muslim, but he's not really a believer.
Yeah.
From your perspective, working with him,
yeah,
is President Obama a true believer?
Well, it's part of the reason why I'm not willing to speak flippantly about President Trump. It's part of the reason why, when I say pray for President Trump, I don't mean prayers that are, dear God, help President Trump see every issue the way I see it and make him act just as I would wish him to act. Because I had to sit through, part of the reason, I think it's theologically right, but part of the reason is the experience of the same people right now who are comparing President Trump to King Cyrus, as we discussed before, and praying, praying those kinds of, I think, wrong-headed prayers for President Obama that were actually just political statements with the veneer of religious faith. And so, it's been years. I prayed with President Obama. I've seen him talk about his faith in public and in private. If you watch his National Prayer Breakfast speeches, he's spoken very clearly about the role of Jesus in his life. And so as much as you can say for any public figure, he's a Christian. And so, I think we need to be careful about treating our political leaders as sort of avatars on which to, everything is up for grabs and up for debate. President Obama said in the National Prayer Breakfast speech something along the lines of his distress at the idea that some folks weren't content to criticize his policies, criticize some of his actions as president, but believed that they had a right and the insight to critique his faith. But he said he said that he remembered Jesus' words to seek the kingdom first, and I think it's important to pay attention to political leaders when they speak that way.
Michael Weir, great conversation.
Great to be with you.
Thanks for coming back on the news.
Thank you.